Covert Access Team podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Recon with CAT Chief Instructor Brian Harris. Recon is an integral part of any physical pen test, but it's also one newbies tend to skip over. They see an open door and they just go for it. Why is that strategy one that you wouldn't recommend?
Okay, so this gets into the question of basically General Patton versus Leroy Jenkins, right? Like you have this idea, the Patton, the three things you need to win a war are audacity, audacity, and audacity. That's great, but when it comes to this type of thing, if you're breaking into a building and you just rush in, kind of Leroy Jenkins style, I see an open door, I'm just going to go for it, you don't know what's on the other side of that door, and also you don't know what it takes to get out. So there have been lots of instances where you'll go through a door, stairwells, etc., and you may not need access cards or anything else to get into the stairwell, but then you need something to get out of the stairwell or any derivative thereof. You may rush in through a door and you might find that that's where all the security guards take their smoke break or hang out or anything else. You don't know what's beyond there, and as a result, you don't know if you can get out, you don't know what kind of obstacles you're going to run into, and you also don't even know if it's advantageous. What if you just ran into a room that goes to like a closet? Right? Like maybe it's wired with a bunch of alarms or sensors, or there's a guard inside and you just rush in and you haven't accomplished anything. So it's you have to balance the two out. Be audacious, but make sure you do it after you've gotten proper recon.
And, I know that there's different types of recon, and some are more useful for some jobs and not for others. Let's walk through the different types of recon.
Right. So when it comes to reconnaissance, generally, the way that I like to describe it is kind of concentric circles that get closer and closer to the middle, right? So smaller and smaller circles overlaid on top of each other. The first kind of recon is the one that you're going to do from the farthest out, and this is OSINT. You can do OSINT from anywhere, but on the other side of the world if you want to. You're far away from the target. There's basically no risk of you getting caught. That's where you should start. The next one where you get a little closer is long-range recon. This is where you're going to be using telescopes or telephoto lenses or anything that you can see at a distance. Usually, it's difficult to know where long range and short range, kind of overlap. But I usually define long range recon as: are you using long range equipment like telescopes, telephoto lenses that have 100+ zoom, that sort of thing. Short-range recon is where you're close to the building. Maybe you're across the street. Maybe you're pretending to walk your dog around the building. You're getting as close to the target building as you can without actually going inside. And then embedded recon is: can you get inside the building under false or real pretexts, like going into a bank to open up a bank account or anything else, to see what's on the inside, the security systems, the cameras, all that kind of stuff. As you get closer, as the circles get closer to the center, the risk to you and your team getting caught or having a confrontation increases. This is why I always recommend start as far away as possible, get as much information, and slowly work your way to a smaller and smaller circle until eventually you're inside the building, ideally, still doing your recon, but you're just still gathering information.
And I think, you allude to an interesting point that recon kind of never stops, because despite how deep you get into the building, you're still looking, you're still keeping an eye out for how people respond to everything. And yeah.
Of course. So, no amount of recon on the outside of the building is going to tell you everything. You're not going to know where exactly, Bob Smith's desk is. You may not know exactly where the server room is. You may not be able to figure out what the floor layout is. There's going to be a lot of instances, or maybe you have picked up the blueprint of the building, but you don't know what type of lock or control mechanism they have for the server room. So any type of recon is always going to be an ongoing process for that exact reason.
Gotcha. Now, why would you use one of those types of recon over the other?
So ideally, you will use all. But there's going to always be situations where it's not really advantageous to use some. So some examples. Let's say that you're in downtown London or some major metropolitan area and your client's building is on the 10th floor in the heart of the city. Well, it might be really difficult in this situation to use long-range recon. You might not have a good angle on it. The area is very dense. You might not be able to, get on a rooftop or get into another building that can see in through the window to actually, do any good. Because keep in mind, no matter how far away, you're always risking something. Even when you're doing OSINT, if you do OSINT in a really stupid way, like say you call up the employment center and you really mess up that phone call when you're trying to talk to the secretary or somebody and you're trying to fish for information, if you really mess that up, yeah, you can set off some alarm bells. You can put them on edge. You can, you raise the alerts. So anytime you're doing recon, there's always some threat. And the closer you get, the higher that threat is. Similarly, what happens if you're doing a really rural environment? Like maybe you're doing an offshore substation, or you're doing a power plant that's in the middle of nowhere. Well, short-range recon in that instance isn't really viable. If you're doing an offshore substation, you're probably not taking a little Zodiac raft and just doing circles around the base of the structure to get close and look at it. Like, it's not really viable to do that. It might be viable to use telescopes on shore if you can see it, or use a boat to get somewhat close to it. But depending on the situation the engagement that you're doing and what the objectives are, there are going to be instances where some types of recon are going to be more advantageous than others, and some may not even be possible.
And you kind of answered this question already, that does every job require every type of recon? You said ideally you'd go through all of them, but some just won't work. So what exactly are you looking for during the recon stage?
So you're looking for as much useful information as possible. When I say that, the general types of things that you'll look for are, when you start off with your OSINT, maybe you're using satellites or Google Earth or something like that. What is the general layout of the building, right? Where's the parking structures? Are there fences? Does it look like there's cameras? How many entrances do you think there are? Does it look like there's guard stations? Like, these are the types of things you're looking for. When you get into your long-range recon, what you're really looking for are things like, what time do the employees show up for work? What's the dress code? Can you get a good picture of the ID badges? Are there third parties that come in? Like, who actually goes into the building? Is it just employees? Or do you notice that it's also cleaners and contractors? When you're looking at ID badges, oftentimes what you'll see in major organizations is you'll see a difference in the ID badge or the lanyard, the thing that holds the ID badge. Maybe they're different colors. Maybe you notice when you're doing your recon that you notice that some employees are wearing blue lanyards and some are wearing black and some are wearing yellow. And it's like, you might not know what that means, but there's a difference. And maybe what you can do further is you notice that everybody who wears a black lanyard, they're dressed very professionally, right? They're in suits and ties, maybe even three-piece suits. But the people who are wearing the yellow lanyards, maybe they're dressed far more casually. And again, that doesn't tell you exactly what you would need to know, but it gives you an idea of, like, if I'm trying to impersonate somebody with a black lanyard, I need to be dressing this way or this well. What time do they show up? Is there a difference? These are the types of things you're going to be looking for. If you can do embedded recon, get into the building, maybe you come into a bank and you say, hey, I'm looking to open up an account. Maybe you show up and say, oh, hey, I'm looking for, I've got a job interview. Is this the right address? And they say, no, it's actually across the street. If you can get inside the building, then you're looking for what type of alarms and cameras they have. Where are they? Are there choke points? Do you notice if the secretary or other employees just wave people through, allowing for tailgating? Is it possible to downgrade security as you walk in or out of the building by, scotch taping some small piece of metal like a paper clip or something on the mag lock, or messing with the plunger, or the strike plate or something of a door to make it less viable. So you're trying to get any piece of information that you may find useful as you go along in your engagement, which is one of the reasons why, by the way, I've said this before, but I always encourage people to start off with auditing, not pen testing. Because as you audit and you walk through buildings and you just start noticing every last possible vulnerability that could go wrong or could be exploited, you'll become very good at walking through a building nonchalantly and spotting every last stupid thing that you could take advantage of. And so when you're doing it on an engagement and you're not trying to get caught, it becomes second nature. It's like breathing. It's just something you just do.
Gotcha. And then I'd like to talk a little bit more about tips and tricks. You've kind of, sprinkled in some advice as we've talked through each type of recon, but let's dig a little deeper. What are some tips and tricks for performing OSINT?
Okay, so for OSINT, first things first, make sure you know what you're doing, right? OSINT is fairly easy, but have actual goals. What is it that you're trying to do, right? So when you're doing OSINT, have a series of objectives. You want to know the building layout, possibly the floor plan. You want to know who works there. You want to know what their email structure is. You might want to know the phone numbers. You might want to know certain people by face. So maybe I've had engagements before where the client contact is like the facility manager, and they want you to target the CFO specifically because he holds the purse strings in this specific case or something. So know what that guy looks like. Know what his name is. See if you can figure out where in the building his office is. Don't be afraid to use satellite data if you can. You can buy satellite data to get like real live well, maybe not live, but very up-to-date coverage. One of the reasons why that's beneficial is that if you look at Google Maps and it says, oh, there's a construction site right here, right next to the building, so you're anticipating there being one, but then you find out that Google Maps hasn't been updated for a year, and that construction site is completely gone and done, and there's something else there, like that changes things, right? So getting that type of information in real time or more up to date is useful. Same thing with Google Street View. Like if you use Google Street View, that's great. But what happens if Google Street View hasn't been updated in 2 years? Like a lot of things might be changed. A lot of things could absolutely be different. Just probably the best advice I can give you is make a list of everything that you think will be useful to you and try to go about resolving it or finding it, but don't stress out about it if you can't find it. If you say, I want to know the floor plan, where everybody sits, and you can't find it, don't kill yourself. You can manage without it. But just, do your best.
And social media can be such a treasure trove in that regard because a lot of times people don't realize how much can be derived from a photo or something like that.
I've used LinkedIn often. When you go to the company website, oftentimes what you'll have people posting on the company website for parties and events, things like this. Sometimes I was on a job recently for a government office, and they were celebrating Christmas. And one of the things that they did was they had some employees who were dressed up like I want to say like Christmas carolers. And they were walking through the building, like doing they'd walk up to somebody's office or an area of the building and sing little Christmas carols. That was a great video because I had somebody literally with a camera walking through the entire building, showing me what everything looked like as they were doing their Christmas carols. So yeah, use social media, use LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's such a great example. I feel like there's a lot to be found on social media. And in terms of long-range recon, do you have any tips or tricks for that?
So long-range recon, okay. If you can find a hiding spot, great. That really helps you. And some ideas of where hiding spots could be. Now, again, this gets into the question of like, what is the difference between long-range and short-range recon, right? Like if I'm across the street sitting in a cafe, is that long or short range? It's like, whatever, it's recon, right? Call it what you want. But so with long range, if you can get into a hotel room, that's excellent. If you've got a hotel room that overlooks the target building, that's fantastic because you can set up all your equipment in there. You can do whatever you need to. You've got unfettered access. If you're doing that, make sure not to, throw the curtains open and just stand, with all the lights on inside, with telescopes or binoculars or something because you really stand out. If you're going to do that, set up your telescope on a tripod or set up something, close the blinds except for a sliver and look at the target building from a few feet away from the curtains and make sure all the lights inside are turned off so that nobody notices you. Also, make sure that you put the Do Not Disturb sign on the hotel door so that the cleaning staff doesn't come in and see an entire reconnaissance, setup in there. Chances are, if you're doing your engagement in a major city that's not close to your headquarters, you're going to be needing a hotel anyway because you're going to, have to be traveling there. You're going to be there for a week or two. So always try to get a hotel that's close and ideally overlooks the target building. And when you get to the hotel, I've never found it an issue if you just say, oh, hey, could you get me a room on this side of the building? Sometimes you'll get a weird look, but it's never really been an issue. So if you can, yeah, great. If you can find a restaurant or a cafe that allows for like working, in the United States, people basically make cafes and restaurants, kind of their second home when it comes to working because there's this hybrid culture. So if you can find an amiable restaurant or cafe that allows for this, then yeah, you can just set up shop and just be sitting there, all day watching. one thing to note when you're doing recon, especially long, short, or whatever, you're going to want to be there before the employees show up because you want to know what time does everybody show up, because people typically stagnate. They kind of, or not stagnate, they kind of stagger in depending on their seniority. So what I mean by that is the cleaning staff or the janitors or the secretaries or people at the lower end of the totem pole, they tend to show up before the CEO, right? So figure out when these people show up, figure out, kind of ideally like, okay, there's usually going to be a kind of a Gaussian, right? A few people trickle in at maybe 7, and then there's a huge influx around 8:30, and then everybody's in the building by, say, 9. So it's kind of figure all that out. But I mean, also, if you can use cars, like let's say that you've got a car that you can park somewhere near the building and you can set up a camera inside the car. Dash cameras and other things are now a common occurrence. So if you can set that up, all the better. Set it up, have it record, run it to, either the car's battery or some type of internal, battery pack or something. And then you've got all kinds of data. Another one, kind of similar with long range is if you've got a parking structure, staying with cars, if you've got a parking structure or something where you can get above the target building or on par with a specific level or room, and you can set up a telescope or a long range camera or something else, and you can just be looking in. I've seen people's laptops, I've gotten passwords, I've gotten all kinds of stuff by just sitting in a car with a telescope and just looking into a target floor for days sometimes, and you get all kinds of information from that. The floor layout, where people work, whose desk is where. If you can see somebody's laptop while they're working, you can get all kinds of sensitive information from that. So, I mean, all of these types of things, right? But don't be afraid to be creative. Another trick is to use static hidden cameras. So if you can afford it and you don't mind risking it getting stolen because you're just leaving it, set up hidden cameras in trash piles or on light posts or anywhere that you think that you can hide them. So for example, let's say that there's a back alleyway to the target building, and there's not really a good way that you can just kind of hang out in an alleyway watching there all day. Plus, it's kind of a waste of your time. But if you can find a way to set up a hidden camera that's going to sit there all day, and then you can come back and get it later and look at the feed, maybe you notice that at lunchtime, somebody props open the rear door for smoke breaks, or somebody, takes lunch out there, or whatever. Like it's a way to double up on recon, especially in areas where it might not be the most advantageous to hang out.
A few follow-up questions from that. The first one being hidden cameras. What is the legality of that?
Okay, so legally speaking, with hidden cameras, within Europe, you have GDPR, and there is always that big issue. So you always need to make sure you're adhering to GDPR and those rules and everything else. Usually, not always, but usually, you are legally allowed, and look this up to make sure in the country and city that you're living in, but usually you are legally allowed to take pictures in public spaces. So if you set up a hidden camera on a city street or something and you're just filming people, there's usually nothing illegal about that. There are some countries that are kind of iffy on that. You need basically two-party consent to videotape or record or anything else. So just look up what the consent laws are in the country that you're operating in, or the state or the city that you're operating in. But usually speaking, there's nothing illegal about taking pictures or videos on public places. But again, just always look it up. Now, there is a moral gray area here where if I'm taking videos and pictures of employees as they're approaching or leaving work or whatever, the employer usually cannot give you authorization to go mess with the employee outside of the actual work hours and the building itself. So for example, if I see that an employee is wearing their ID badge and they leave the building for lunch and they go to a coffee shop or a restaurant or whatever, the employer themselves can't really authorize me to stalk them, go into the restaurant, strike up a conversation with them, and clone their badge from there. So it is kind of a gray legal area to do that. But as far as just taking pictures and cameras, usually it's fine. But again, just check the laws in the area you're operating.
And I imagine if it is a country that requires telling someone that they are on camera, if the employer has its own cameras, they would have already told their employees. So if you were on their premises premises, you would be able to piggyback off of that potentially.
That's usually correct, especially in Europe where you have GDPR laws. But just explain this to the client, make sure that you're in compliance with whatever laws are in your area, and you're usually fine.
And, you also mentioned the car as a potential way to gather recon, and I imagine also gear storage if you can't find a hotel room close enough. So just maybe tinted windows.
Yeah, definitely make sure that if you're using a car that it has some form of tinted windows, because you obviously don't want to have like a whole camera or telescope setup rig in the back of your car with untinted windows, because that's going to be really suspicious. But you raise another interesting point, right? Like if you are, this kind of goes back to the hotel room thing. When you are picking at hotel rooms, always pick the most advantageous one. So I run all over the world. I've been in hotel rooms more times than I can count doing this exact thing. But if your hotel room is on the other side of the city and it's a 30-minute drive to the client site, and let's say you don't have access to a car, or you have access to a car but you don't have access to parking near the place, where are you putting all your stuff? Because you can't go around the Target building with a hiking backpack full of equipment. So there's a logistics problem here that you have to take into consideration before you, like this is one of the things that you'll be looking up during OSINT phase, or maybe even the pre-planning phase, where you're trying to figure out, all right, where's the hotels that we can use? Where's the parking we can use? Where can we set cars up? Do we have access to cars? That sort of thing. Because if your hotel room is half an hour away from the client site, you don't have access to a car, and let's say you've got 2 people on the engagement, which is a very small team, well, you're going to have to be very on the ball when it comes to how are you planning this out, who's bringing what equipment, when are you bringing what equipment, because it could be a huge problem if one of you goes inside and then it turns out that you need something that's back at the hotel room. Well, you're going to be hanging out without it for quite a while.
And last follow-up question from that bit of tips and tricks was, if you are hanging out near an office building for an extended period of time, like for example, you gave the example of staying in a cafe for like 2 whole days. At what point do you start becoming obvious? And do you have to kind of adjust disguises, or kind of cover your tracks in that way, or?
So when it comes to disguises, you want to have, I ideally recommend that you have several personas. A persona a disguise is part of the persona, but what I mean by that is if I show up in a tight-fitting black shirt, I'm a relatively stocky guy, short brown hair with a beard, right? If I show up that way to a cafe, well, I can show up that way every day. I've just become a common occurrence, right? The employees, the customers, they don't care if you are in the cafe. It's now become your haunt, right? As long as you're not breaking the law and as long as you look the part, that's fine. What will become suspicious is if I show up on Monday and Tuesday looking like that, and then I show up on Wednesday wearing a blonde wig and a baseball cap. Like, somebody was probably going to notice that, especially at close range over a long period of time, and trying to switch personas in that way, that could throw you off. And your persona may be in one disguise or one persona. You're a businessman, you're dressed professionally, you've got a briefcase, you're wearing a suit. But if you show up the next day with a wig on and you're wearing like a Hawaiian shirt and you kind of smell and you're not looking professional, again, that's the type of thing that might get you caught because they're going to see you for long periods of time. So whatever you're doing, just really give in to that persona for that part of the engagement and only switch if you need to switch. Don't just do it preemptively.
So you don't feel like, for example, you talk about how you only have so many lives, and every time you get noticed or do something that could draw attention, you strike 1 or more lives depending on how egregious the error is.
Right.
With recon, so if you're like walking around a building, say you don't have a cafe where you can sit and camp all day without it seeming weird. If you're like walking around the building and you're having to have like a pretense to be by the building, do you have to change disguises? You
can. So keep in mind that most people, myself included, we are not Mossad level masters of disguise. Given that, think of disguises as kind of the closer you get to a person, especially people who have seen you before, the more likely they are to notice you. So if you're wearing wigs or, different clothes or any type of actual disguise, at 50 feet, they're not going to notice you. At 20 feet, you're starting to get to the point where they might pick up on you. At 10 to 5 feet, yeah, they're probably going to notice something's off because your wig might not be sitting correctly. You might be sweating. They might notice that you have some feature about you, whatever. So as long as you are at a distance, wearing multiple disguises or personas usually isn't an issue. Going back to the cafe thing, well, I'm talking to the barista every time I go into the cafe. I'm sitting around people for hours and hours and hours. And if they've seen me over and over and over again, and this time I just show up wearing a wig, it does definitely raise the probability that somebody's going to catch you. So you don't necessarily need multiple disguises, but if you are moving about, first things first, you should have a team size that helps you to kind of make all this not so egregious. So if I'm the guy who's walking around the building on Monday, maybe my colleague is the one walking around on Tuesday, and then I show back up on Wednesday, that becomes much less noticeable because people are not usually that observant. But if you are running solo, then yeah, use personas, but just keep distance if possible.
Gotcha. And I realize with all those segues, we've kind of gotten off track, but the next thing I wanted to talk about were your tips and tricks for performing short-range recon.
Yeah, okay. So short-range recon, again, is where you get as close to the client side as you can without going inside. Now, some buildings will be more advantageous for this than others. Rural type of places, usually short-range recon isn't really an option, right? So if you're at a research center, in the middle of nowhere, or some type of laboratory or a power plant or whatever, it becomes really difficult to walk around the building without being noticed. So it's going to be off the table. But if you're doing corporate environments, especially inside cities, yeah, short-range recon is really easy, right? So in these instances, some tips that you could try. If you have a dog, if it's in the city that you live, walk the dog. Walk the dog around the building. The reason dogs are fantastic is because people who have dogs have to walk that thing multiple times a day. It's normal to see the same person walking a dog over and over and over in the same neighborhood. So that's an instant cover. If you have a colleague that you don't mind pretending to be a couple with, you can walk around the building and you can pretend to take pictures of each other or together or whatever. That's also a common thing that people do. It allows you, I've used my wife many times in this instance where you'll hold their hands, you'll walk around, you'll take pictures of them, with the client site in the background or other things. So if you can do something like that, great. The universal rule is that a single man hanging out outside of a building at like 10 p.m. is suspicious. Two guys hanging out outside of a building at 10 p.m., they're almost certainly up to no good. But a man and a woman are just out for a stroll. And it's an instant, that type of thing is an instant remediation to suspicion. So you can use stuff like this. If you can get to a cafe or if there's anything around the client site that allows somebody to sit there for long periods of time, like a cafe or a restaurant that's right across the street. In Europe, there's a lot of cafes, kebab shops, and other things where you can sit outside. If you can sit at one of those things and just hang out and watch, again, all the better.
And the last type of recon I'd like to dig into tips and tricks on is embedded recon. What advice do you have for that portion of recon?
Okay, so embedded recon will be what you do last. Embedded recon is the closest you're getting to the target site because you're actually inside. Now again, there are going to be instances where you can't do embedded recon. If you go into an oil derrick or an offshore wind farm, substation, or something like that, you can't really do embedded recon. There isn't really I'm just here to open up a bank account or something. It doesn't exist. But in a lot of corporate environments, you can do embedded recon to some degree. So first things first. Before you ever do embedded recon, you should have been doing all the other forms of recon first. Is there a public or accessible establishment inside the building, regardless as to what it is? So, for example, I've talked about shared office spaces before. This is a very common thing, and it's becoming more and more common. Fewer and fewer organizations today have a building. Oftentimes what happens today is that because the hybrid culture and COVID, kind of did away with a lot of office spaces, you now have one building that has, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 different companies running around, depending on the size of the building. If any of those floors, even if it's not the first floor, but if any of those floors have something public that you can go to, whether it's a cafe, a restaurant, anything, start making that your frequent haunt. Because, especially during work hours, because if there's a cafe or a restaurant or anything like that anywhere in that building, there's a very good chance that actual employees will also frequent it. So it gives you a place to be on site. It gives you cover of status that, there's nothing suspicious about sitting at a cafe or a restaurant or whatever. As long as it's okay, you can be working on your laptop or anything else, and that's also not an issue. You'll be able to see, if employees do frequent it, you'll get to see their badges, where they hang them, what the badge looks like, if they're using lanyards or waist clips, what they're dressed like. You're getting to see a lot of this type of information. When you're doing embedded recon, in my opinion, first things first, if you're trying to clone badges, think about how you're going to go about it. If the employees are wearing badges around their neck, like a necklace, or on the hip, you're probably going to want to be doing something like long-range RFID cloning. So bring those with you. If you notice that every single employee wears it around the neck, so they're wearing like a necklace with the badge hanging at their chest level, well, having a long-range reader inside of a briefcase that you hold with your hand is not going to help you, because you have to hold it up to their chest. But having a backpack with a long-range reader facing behind you would. Because then you can throw the backpack on, you can find an excuse to get in front of them or behind them in line or maybe in an elevator or whatever, and you can try to clone the badge that way. Conversely, if every employee you notice, or most of them, are wearing their badges on their hip, a backpack isn't going to help you, but a briefcase might, because then you can find a way to, position the briefcase relatively close by. So, if you notice that employees, they go to the cafe or they go to a restaurant, they take the ID card off and they put it on a table or anything like that, then long-range readers aren't really going to help you in that situation, but something like a flipper attached to an RFID extension cord might, where you can touch it with your hand or an elbow or wherever you put it. So think about how you're going to clone a badge and set that up accordingly. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the more options you have. If the only thing you have is a flipper, then obviously all the long-range stuff becomes instantly off the table. But I highly recommend, if you have the tools and you have the money to do it, become a walking RFID cloning, field or entity. Have all those options available to you, because it just makes your life easier. Similarly, when you're doing embedded recon, also be a walking camera. Don't be afraid to have button cameras and watch cameras and use your phone as a camera, and cameras hidden in coffee cups or anything else. It is much better for your team if you can show them a video of what happened rather than try to describe it. Because also, if you're just trying to notice things, you're almost always going to miss stuff. Maybe you missed a camera or a sensor or an alarm or something. But if you have a video of what you saw, then you can revisit it, but also other people on your team can revisit it and go, oh, that's that new technology, or oh, that's that new type of alarm, or oh, that, whatever. So they might be able to point something out, and it's very helpful. Also, it helps you for evidence, because when you are trying to break into buildings, you have to be taking pictures and video for the client. You can't just break into the building and say, no, I actually did it, trust me. You have to actually show the client what you did. You have to actually give them evidence and information. So taking, videos and camera feeds and everything like that, it's very helpful. The only thing that I will mention is make sure you know what types of cameras you're using in what situations. So for example, if you're using a watch camera, a camera that's embedded in a wristwatch, don't use that if you're in motion, because all you're going to see is this constant back and forth, like you're on the most obnoxious, ship that's under heavy bad seas or something constantly, because it becomes really literally nauseating to watch a watch camera as somebody's moving through a building, because it's just back and forth constantly. You don't realize how much you move your arm until you try to watch one of these things.
And that's actually a really good segue to my next question, which is all about everybody's favorite topic, tools and gadgets. What is in your Recon toolbox? Okay,
so Recon, for OSINT and everything else, a phone and a laptop, right? For Recon purposes, you might need to make phone calls, you might need a laptop. That's usually about it. For long-range recon, telescopes, telephoto lens cameras, things like this. Yes, of course. I'm not such a stickler to say, oh, you have to go with this brand or that. No. As long as the camera can do what you need it to do, it's fine. If you can't afford a really nice, $5,000 camera with, that has like a infinite zoom lens on it, that's fine. That's where most people start out. So then don't use the long range camera stuff, from a mile away. Try to get closer and use it, to take pictures of people's ID badges or something else where you can. If you have access to a car, especially one with tinted windows, great. If you have access to a van with tinted windows, that's fantastic. Because it's not going to look James Bond, but having access to a big van where you've moved all the stuff out is fantastic because you can put all your stuff in there. You can have an entire team, use that to move around. You can park it somewhere and set up gear and equipment, and even, your cyber guy can sit in that van, whatever you need to do. I highly recommend when it comes to embedded recon, you're going to want cameras, you're going to want RFID cloning stuff, all the stuff that I previously talked about. Flippers, iCopies, long-range cloners, rogue readers, anything that is helpful to you. But basically, at the end of the day, all you're really wanting is you're wanting technology that helps you see and gain information. So cameras, telescopes, it doesn't have to be anything, state of the art. You can literally buy most of this on Amazon. Just buy something of high-ish quality. You don't need things like long-range thermal cameras or anything else. Just a telescope or a long-range camera for your long range. That's great. A laptop and a phone for your OSINT. That's probably enough of what you need. Some type of camera equipment for short range and embedded recon, whether you could literally just use your cell phone. If that's all you have is just your cell phone, that's enough. You can make it work. And that's when you're starting to get into this, that's what you're going to do, right? You're not going to have $30,000 worth of equipment that you have at your disposal. You're going to have the bare minimum, and you're going to have to make whatever you have work for you. So pigeonhole, okay, all I have is a flipper with an extender on it and a phone. Okay, well we're gonna have to make that work. So make it work. Just be creative. That's as the adversaries. That's what you do. Is you have to be creative.
And I would add a little caveat to what Brian just said about how any device that can help you gather information, and also devices that can help you gather information while reducing suspicion, would also be in your toolkit. So I actually had an idea with the van. If you had a magnetic decal for, florist or, fruit vendor or IT or, some plumbing, some kind of service, sticking that on the side automatically reduces suspicion, because when people see a white van, I know as a woman, when I see a white van, I'm like, I'm going to cross to the other side of the street.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can, absolutely. If you have disguises, whether it's for you, whether it's for your vehicles or anything else, yeah, absolutely. You can use them and incorporate them. It's one more tool in your toolkit, right? I've impersonated cleaners, I've impersonated plumbers and AC repair guys, I've impersonated consultants and new employees. I've been the role of all kinds of people. I was a window repair guy once, with doing that same thing where we had a van. We actually went out and bought an actual pane of glass and had it inside. Like, if you can do that, great. If you've got the decals on vans or uniforms, if you've got a Deliveroo driver or Wolt or any types of these food service providers, anybody on your team, like Moonlights is one of these things, or you can get access to the uniform, great. Now, there is some legal issues there that if you're impersonating a Wolt driver, I don't know if Wolt's going to come after you, so do be aware of that if it's an actual business. But yeah, if you have access to that stuff, it's all the better. Again, more tools in your toolkit. One of the things that you should do, now this isn't necessarily recon, but this is kind of the pre-planning phase. When you get an engagement, before you do anything else, one of the things that you should always be doing is make a checklist or an inventory list of everything you have at your disposal for the engagement. That means who's on your team? How many people are coming? What are their expertises? What is their experience level? What are they good at? What are they bad at? What vehicles do you have access to? What equipment do you have access to? Does it still work? Have you tested it in a while? Is it that, 5 years ago we ran a physical engagement, we used this tool and it absolutely destroyed Windows. It's like, okay, well, have you tested it in 5 years? Are you sure it still works? So, take that inventory, do that pre-planning phase of stuff and figure out everything you have at your disposal, because that will help you to figure out what things are available to you, what types of recon. If you don't have a long-range camera or a telescope, if you literally don't have it, even if long-range recon is the best type of recon, it's off the table to you because you don't have the equipment. So you're going to have to think of something else.
And then now that we have all of this information about recon, I'm curious if you can maybe share some stories, some examples of times that you've used these different types of recon in concert to get into a building.
Yeah, sure. So, OSINT, one of the, we've social engineered people from afar. We've contacted, we've discovered. So I'll give you an example. There was one time where I used a member of my team who's a legitimate journalist to figure out that a specific corporation was very proud of a product through OSINT, and we had this person contact the organization, set up a meeting to run a real story about them, and other members of our team came in as the producer and the camera guy and other things. So just through OSINT alone, we found a way in through the building, and we found a way, and we set up a way into the building before we even got close to it, all because we were able to social engineer them from afar. With long-range recon, I have used telescopes before to find employees who crack windows open in offices, and we were able to see that not only did certain windows have windows cracked open, but those exact employees would leave. So we could see through a telescope what the employees looked like, and then we could see at lunchtime that not only had they left the windows open, but we could see they literally left the building. And there was nobody in these offices during lunch, which told us that we had about 45 minutes at a specific time of day when there was an open window that we could crawl in through, and nobody was in that office. So again, that's very useful, right? Short-range recon, I've talked before about how sometimes compliance can get you in trouble. I might have mentioned this story previously, but it's one of the best short-range recon examples of how, in my opinion, of how compliance can get you in trouble. Where I'm sitting at a kebab shop across the street from the Target building. This is a high-security facility, armed guards, unclonable badges, biometric scanners, all this kind of stuff. And about 6 a.m. during shift change for the physical security guards, we see a security guard walking around the perimeter of the building. He opens up every door, he says something into his radio, walks off, opens up another door, says something in his radio, and keeps doing it. And we speculated, which we were correct about, that at shift change, what he was doing was checking that when he opened the doors, the physical SOC or the facility manager, whoever it was, would get an SMS or an alert that door number 5, door number 6, door number 7 had been opened, and making sure that that worked. But some of these doors had gotten kind of weathered over time and whatever, and he had been doing this over and over again. And there was a couple doors that he walked away from that took upwards of 30 seconds to actually close, which is great because that means that from the time he walks away, you have half a minute to get in there and get through the door, or disable the security or something. So again, short-range recon gave us that one. Embedded recon, oftentimes I tend to daisy chain embedded recon with what I refer to as asset acquisition, where I'll start chatting up employees or people in the building or anything else to try and get information and basically make buddies and make friends, right? Maybe that's the cleaning staff, maybe that's a barista who works in a public cafe on the ground floor, maybe it's actual employees, whatever. In one particular instance, I was able to social engineer a secretary to figure out that they had a cleaning staff that showed up each evening. And then we used short-range recon to figure out exactly what time they showed up and which entrance they came in from. So by doing embedded recon, we figured out, and social engineering, we figured out that they had cleaning staffs that showed up every night. We figured out exactly what the employee badges looked like, what the lanyards looked like, etc. We were able to steal a lanyard, not a badge, but an actual lanyard. So we put a badge that we had printed one out that looked exactly like the real employee badges. The cleaning staff was going to show up every night at about 6:30. They were going to come in through the front. We were going to break in through the rear as soon as they walked in. And by the time we met in the middle, they were just going to assume that we were, an after-hours employee who's just, working overtime, which they did. So again, these types of recon will give you likely infiltration methods. They'll give you ideas on how you can get in. You might not take them. You might not actually go after every single one of them, but they can help you to at least discover vulnerabilities, methods of entry, or they might shoot down ideas that you had. When you're doing the OSINT phase, you might say, oh, I see through satellite imagery that there's this rear door right here and it looks like a good target. But then when you get on site, maybe that rear door is definitely not something you can get in. Maybe it's highly alarmed, highly surveilled. Maybe there's a security guard station right there, whatever. So, use all these things to your advantage.
Is there anything else about long-range recon that you think we should or any type of recon that you think we should discuss that we haven't touched on already?
Right. Okay, so one thing about recon, one question that I often get is how much recon is enough? And there's really no answer to that, but usually what I say is that when you're doing an active engagement, about 50% of the engagement time will just be recon. So if you've got 2 weeks to do an engagement, then there's a very good chance that about 1 week, the first week of that, is just going to be a series of reconnaissance of various forms. The rationale for that is, one, it prevents the Leroy Jenkins thing. It prevents somebody on your team from getting there on day one, seeing an open door, and just rushing in. Maybe that works, but there's a very good chance that that's going to burn you, and you will likely never do business with that client again, at least for physical engagements, if you finally convince them to give you a 2, 3, 4 week engagement, and on day 2, one of your employees rushes in, gets burned, and they really suck at their escape clause. They burn the entire thing, and that's it. So focus on at least 50% of the time being recon. Because by doing that, you'll have very good ideas. You'll be very comfortable with the building. You'll be very comfortable with how the employees operate, what they do, where they are, all that kind of stuff. And then you can spend the rest of the time going through methodically every one of your infiltration methods you noted in that first week or first 50%, and try and go through it that way. Another thing that you should be aware of is recon is a never-ending process. So if you've got a 2-week engagement and you spent the entire first week doing recon, and on Monday morning of the second week, you're like, all right, Monday morning, we're going to go through and we're going to try this engagement method. And you show up to do that, and something is different, right? Maybe you say, well, we're at 10 p.m., we notice that the security guard is in the front of the building, that he makes these rounds the same every day. The security guard is in the front. We're going to go in through the back. And 10 p.m. on Monday, you show up and there's a second security guard and he's in the back of the building and he wasn't there last week. Okay, you got to call it off. You got to call it off and do more recon. You got to come up with something else, because that type of thing does happen so I'll give you a real example. I've been on buildings before, especially during COVID, where you'll show up and there's like 2 guys in the entire building. And you're like, oh, this is going to be super easy. You do all your recon, you come up with all these methods on getting in, and the day comes that you're going to execute the plan, and the building is packed. Because they had some schedule. They had something where it was like, oh, this week right here, everybody's going to be working remote, but this next week, that's when everybody's coming back to the office. And if you didn't know that and you just show up, well, that sucks. I've had instances before where you do recon and everybody is in like a really nice business suit, super formal wear. And you're planning, okay, on Friday, we're going to do our first, infiltration method. And you start walking towards the client side at 9 a.m. in a 3-piece suit, and everybody's wearing Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops because it's actually casual Friday. And you didn't know that. Well, you better peel off and do some more recon or come up with another plan, because if you're the only guy in a suit and everybody else is wearing casual wear, you stick out. So always be prepared to stand down. Always be prepared to revisit recon of any form.